Hello, this is Mr. Salmingo. I'll be lecturing you today about social studies or social science, and this one's about the European inroads or how the British became from traders to rulers. So in this particular section, we're looking at uh, again where we left off in social studies. It's been a while, but where we left off is uh, just talking about the rulers in India, things like that. Now we're talking about how Britain started to slowly, and then the Europeans in general started to slowly make contact with India. First of all, we could start with Calicut. Um, it started its point of contact when the ruler of Calicut, or also known as the Zamorin, encouraged merchant trade. And you may have seen in the picture before you, this is a picture of Vasco da Gama coming to Calicut. So here at the Malabar coast, this was a key link in global oceanic routes. So this is place number one, the Calicut. Next is Surat. The Mughals initially, if you remember what we had talked about before, the Mughals initially controlled the port city of Surat. This Portuguese and Dutch traders linked Surat, and it was a key place, an area for the Southeast Asian spice trade. And things that came out of here, cotton textiles, indigo, that was big here in Surat. Down here we have Masalaputnam of the Coromandel coast. We had Golconda kings, and they oversaw a thriving trade with Southeast Asia from this port over here. They traded textiles in exchange for gold bullion, and the Portuguese, the Danish, the Dutch, the English all used Matsulapatnam for trading or trade posts. And the last one, Bengal, Shah Jahan ousted the Portuguese from their base at Hooghly. So then the Dutch and the British controlled the trade. And this is also, in terms of what are these coastal trade posts known for, this was known for muslin and silk. So after a while, in 1600, we had the British establish what they call the East India Company, which is something that you may have known and we've talked about before, a corporation, like a business, at some point eventually ruling a country. So it was founded in 1600 through a charter from Queen Elizabeth. It was granted a 15-year monopoly over England's trade with India, so no other company, no other business can do trade between England and India other than the British East India Company, or from now on called the EIC. It was a joint stock company format, so what this format is that it limited the risk, so that English merchant investors, doing this long-distance trade, all the pressure wasn't on one person. Having a joint stock where people could invest and everyone has kind of an equal pay in it, made sure that investors weren't having such high risk in a long distance trade. And just as a footnote, the EIC, its first two voyages were to Sumatra and Indonesia. And one of the first things that it did or brought in this trade was 1 million pounds of pepper. There you go. So some of the EIC footholds in India are the four big cities that the EIC were responsible for. As I click through these, you'll see different cities. The first one was a Gujarati port city that faced Maratha attacks during the 17th century. That was Surat. We talked about that earlier. The EIC arrived in 1608 on its third voyage. Remember, the first two voyages were to Indonesia, Sumatra. This one was the first one in India, Surat. The EIC received Mughal recognition after they defeated the Portuguese in the Battle of Aswali. And diplomat Thomas Roe gained Mughal permission to construct a factory here in 1613. So this is one of the it is the very first foothold in India or city, Surat, from the EIC, for the EIC. City number two, it reached a population of 100,000, which is, a lot in those days in 1700. And that gigantic city was Madras. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Madras was a property purchased by the EIC from a local ruler. Again, it's on the east side, the Coromandel coast in 1640. City number three, a port city, a large port city that had 7 sandbars. This was Bombay. You may have heard of Bombay, one of the more popular cities in India. It was a gift from the Portuguese to the EIC in 1668 as a dowry. So when Princess Catherine married King Charles, the gift of the Portuguese was Bombay to the EIC. And lastly, city number 4, which was the major hub of EIC, like the capital of the EIC of all the operations. The headquarters was in Calcutta. Again, another popular city you may have heard of. Along with the Dutch at Mughal permission, the EIC was allowed to set up trade there in 1632. So this was kind of like the 4 major cities for the EIC. Now, let's talk about the interactions with different people. So let's talk about first with the Mughals. If you remember where we left off, the Mughals were the last kind of rulers of India after we had, after we had left off on section 2. So the very, very first interaction between EIC and Mughals, Jahangir, remember that was the ruler of the Mughals. When English representatives came in 1608, 1612, Jahangir said like, nope, don't want it, don't care, get out of here. Didn't want to deal with any of these English representatives. So that was the initial contact. Then, we have a little cartoon here, but Emperor, I got 25,000 gold pieces and a letter from King James. And they're basically saying, I don't need your gold, I don't need your wool, I don't need your pepper. We got the Portuguese here, I don't need you English representatives. So after a while, they start to find favor with the Mughals. So after defeating the Portuguese in 1612, remember the Portuguese were there, so they kind of found favor with them by defeating the Portuguese that were there. As guests of the Mughals, the EIC was allowed to conduct its operations from 1617 to the 1660s. Then there was a standoff. So feeling that the Mughals were starting to interfere with their trade, the EIC started having blockades in Surat and Chittagong in 1686. And then the Mughals then blocked Bombay, and the EIC conceded. So we got the standoff where, all right, so you're blocking us, so we're going to block you, and they're going to block that. So there was a tension, there was a standoff here. And lastly, there was friendship with Farooq Siyar. The EIC, it gained privilege of duty-free exports. So when you talk about duty-free, we're talking about they're allowed to export, they're allowed to essentially do trade without having to pay a tax to the government or to whoever was collecting the taxes, from Emperor Farooq Siyar in 1717. So it's like they built a friendship, they built a relationship where the Mughals, kind of trusted and wanted to develop a relationship with the British. So the Dutch still had to pay a fee, still had to pay this privilege, this fee, this duty, and the EIC paid like a very, very low yearly rate. So they got pretty, financially it was very beneficial for this to have this friendship. And they said, go ahead. Again, this is a picture of Farooq Siyar. He said, go ahead, settle in inland Bengal. I'll even let you mint coins in Bombay. So again, very, very friendly with the British. Now let's talk about EIC versus the French. The French kind of had their own business and organization too. They called the CIO, the Campagne des Indes Orientales, or the CIO. It was founded in 1664, so much later than the EIC. Remember, the EIC was 1600. They gained control of a place in India, Pondicherry, in 1674. And they were under more direct control of the crown or of the king than the EIC. The EIC was kind of its own separate entity, its business. CIO was like under control of the crown or the royalty of the French. It was like completely controlled, whereas the EIC was separate. It grew really fast, and it had different or additional bases in Chandernagore, Matsulapatnam, and Malabar. So we had some conflicts between the French and the British. The first one was the War of the Austrian Succession. In this one, the French captured Madras, and then the British regained it after the war in exchange for Cape Breton Island. So initially, the French got Madras in the whole India, in the whole breakdown of India. The French had Madras first, but after this War of the Austrian Succession, the British regained Madras. In the 7 Years' War, the French, the French and the British fought again, and in this case, the French lost most of their holdings in India, except for Pondicherry, and they retained that way until 20th century, 1950. Here's some vocabulary that you need to know. The right to collect these are all Indian terms, so it's going to be hard for you to memorize, but we're going to go through this one by one. The terms of the trade. The right to collect a region's revenue, that's called Diwani. So it's like, if you are doing business in my area, I'm allowed to collect a portion of your money, the profits that you make. That's called Diwani, that right. The Portuguese licensing system for merchants, that's called Cartaza. A tenant farmer is called a riot. A credit network, sort of like, I'll owe you later, the IOU type of system. Those were called Hawala. A wealthy landowner was called a zamindar. And the Persian ward, which we'll talk about later, sepoy is an Indian soldier, but the Persian word from which sepoy derives from is sipahi. So 6 different Indian words that you need to be familiar with. And now we get this buildup in Bengal, or the buildup of this tension between British and Indian. So first of all, the private trade starts to build up. The EIC merchants trade along regional inland routes. Remember, they have duty-free status, so they start exploiting it basically and using more and more trade because, hey, they're not being taxed for it. Then there was a tension between the EIC and the Nawab. Nawab Alavari Khan of Bengal, he doesn't like the EIC merchants interfering with their own personal trade. So it's kind of like we had our own lemonade business stand here, and now you're coming in with you're coming with this factory of a lemonade factory and interfere. Now we can't sell our own lemonade factory within our own country. So Nawab Alavardi Khan says, like, dude, like, I'm upset, I'm pissed off. Okay, so what Nawab does is he bolsters his army. Alavardi Khan and his successor Siraj ud Dawla try to extract more tribute from the trading companies. Okay, so like these trading companies are there. We want more. I know it used to be duty free, but we're expecting more stuff. So let's go back to this guy, Siraj ud Dawla. He was only 19 when he got the throne. He was very strong-headed, very he wasn't the strong-headed. He was very, I don't know. He wasn't very nice. Nobody he didn't try to appeal to people. Like, he was very strong-minded in the sense that he wanted his way, and if you don't like it, too bad. So he alienated the key players in the region, so like other companies, EIC, other countries, whatever, including local elites, powerful creditors, such as the Jagat Seth. So the Jagat Seths, for lack of a better term, think of them as Visa or MasterCard. They're this big credit company, right? So because he didn't care who he upset like these creditors because of, what he wanted. So in 1756, he attacked Calcutta to prove that, he was super powerful over the British. 40 English prisoners suffocated in the Black Hole of Calcutta. And then this started the chain of events, which was the Battle of Plassey, which is something that you really need to know. I mean, you might leave off here at the Battle of Plassey. So here are the 2 key players, Robert Clive and Siraj ud Dawla. Robert Clive, again, we got this fake cartoon going on. He's like, I have 10 ships of shoulders from Madras, which is huge. He says, you're going to see what happens after that Black Hole of Calcutta. He's going to say, all right, after you did that, you're going to see what happens to those who mistreat me. So Siraj is like, okay, he steps back. He's like, okay, fine, you can have it, whatever. But after that, Robert Clive is like, he could have said like, okay, fine, whatever. But he's like, no, I want it all. You pissed me off. So he partners up with the people that don't like Siraj. Remember, he alienated and made enemies out of a lot of people. So he teams up with, again, this Visa, Jagat Seth, and Mir Jafar. These are the money. They team up with him by giving Robert Clive money, generous trade rights, and they said like, hey, if you dethrone Siraj ud Dawla, we'll give you more stuff. So this started the Battle of Plassey in 1757. So when they start to fight, all of a sudden all these soldiers, don't show up for Siraj ud Dawla. And he's like, hey, where did all my soldiers go? Well, because of all the money that Jagat Seth and the English have, they paid off these soldiers, and now he didn't have any soldiers to fight for him because they just basically bought out his army. So eventually he's gone and replaced by Mir Jafar, who's the new Nawab of Bengal, Mir Jafar. And because of the power that they've asserted, the EIC has more territory. They said they can mint coins, and they'll protect this new guy as much as needed. So that's the end of the story, but it's not the end of the story. So we're going to talk about in a later video the path to rulership, but hopefully you understand a little bit about the trade terms, and all that stuff. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to y'all later.